Thanks, Kelly. Welcome everyone to Trauma Informed Legal Services and the last presentation of the VOCA grantee training. Thanks for hanging in there and signing up to attend this. Just in the way of introduction, and while I go through my introduction, I am going to ask that if you have heard me present on this before, if you would type a number 2 in the chat box. And then if this is your first time, just type number 1. And then Kelly, you can let me know what that balance looks like, because now I'm unable to see the chat screen and I don't want to start clicking because I don't want to mess anything up.
Okay.
But I am the legal director at the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Rape. And prior to my time at PCAR, which I've been at PCAR for about 4 years, I lived and worked in Florida and with legal services serving survivors of domestic violence. So the bulk of my career has been in providing legal services to victims of trauma. About 2 years ago, PCARS received some grant funding and we started a legal assistance project. We call that the Sexual Violence Legal Assistance Project, where we provide legal representation for survivors of sexual assault, abuse, and harassment who are unable to receive free legal services in the counties where they reside. So I'm sure there's probably some on the line who have made a referral to us, and most of our referrals come from the local rape crisis centers. The Pennsylvania Coalition Against Rape is the oldest state coalition in the United States. Our mission is to eliminate all forms of sexual harassment, abuse, and assault, and to fight for the rights and the needs of survivors. We work in conjunction with the network of rape crisis centers, providing services in every county in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and that's our contact information there on the screen. So today, I'm hoping, since this is the last training, you'll leave feeling like, oh, that was fun, I'm glad I signed up. But at any time during the presentation, please make sure to use self-care. If you need to check out for a minute or two, whatever it is you need to do, know that you have the option to do that, and that is fine. So our agenda for today, what I hope to cover is what is a trauma-informed approach, how does what I know about trauma impact the work that I do, and how can I discuss trauma in the courtroom. So before we get started, Kelly, can you let me know about 1s or 2s? How's that look?
Sure. I believe I saw about 4 2s. It's overwhelmingly 1s.
Okay, great. So either way, it'll be a time for all of us to refresh our skills and to hopefully grow as better service providers. So we'll talk about understanding trauma. Now, with this global pandemic that we're in, I'm sure all of us can agree that we all have a more personal understanding of trauma and what that feels like. And I always say that trauma is a people issue. If you live long enough, you will experience trauma. And now all of us have had that experience in one way or another. I know I laugh at myself almost every time I go to the supermarket now. Like one thing, it makes me nervous that people will not follow the arrows on the floor. Like the arrows that say, you know, only walk one way, come down the other way. It seems like I'm always bumping into someone who is not following the arrow. And then at the checkout where there's the squares and you stand 6 feet apart from one another, how I begin to like I could feel my heart racing up when someone stands in my square. But it makes me laugh because I don't feel comfortable saying, like, hey, can you get out of my square? So I say nothing. I keep like trying to inch forward, thinking that they'll get it, but normally they don't. Every time I move up, they move up a little faster. So honestly, I think that's a minimal trauma, very minimal compared to what our clients face, but it just, it's a way to have more empathy around what it's like for someone to sit with trauma when we are now all experiencing trauma in one way or another. So when we talk about trauma and why as a legal service provider is this important for me to know? Well, because of the rules of professional conduct. Rule 1.1 requires that we provide competent representation. And then it defines that. And it's not just about legal knowledge, but it says the skill and preparation reasonably necessary for representation. And it is my contention that as VOCA grantees and service providers to the clients that we serve, in order to provide competent representation, we must understand trauma. So let's take a look at the definition we're going to use today. What is trauma? Now, this definition comes from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. Their website has lots of information on trauma. So when we talk about trauma, we're talking about an event that is experienced by an individual as physically, emotionally harmful, or life-threatening that has long-lasting effects. So that's the basic definition that we're going with today. Now, when we talk about trauma-informed approaches, I want you to think about it as simply as, is there a way that I can change my approach to clients to be more sensitive to the traumas that they face? Don't focus on what you can't afford to do because of grant funding. Think about what you can do. Think about, how do I express empathy? Is there a way in dealing with each client that I can give a piece of my heart and not just a piece of my intellect? Am I willing to not make assumptions, to listen, to understand, and not just to have a reply? Let's take a look at what the research says are some of the approaches that we should be using. And these are kind of like overarching principles. To understand trauma is to understand that the manner in which a survivor of trauma presents as an individual and the manner in which they present their story are intricately connected to the traumas that they face. So the question then that we want to ask ourselves as service providers is, am I implementing principles and practices to meet the survivor in a space that is safe, empowering, and that creates a collaborative relationship to seek justice? And in order to do that, research suggests these 4 R's. We want to realize, recognize, respond, and resist. So when we talk about realize, we're going to realize the impact of trauma, that it's going to affect and it's going to overlap into every area of this client's life. We're going to recognize or be familiar with the signs and symptoms of trauma. Now, I'm sure most people have probably heard of the fight, flight, or freeze responses. And those are some common responses to trauma. They're not the only, but those are like the most common ones that we hear about. And what we're not going to discuss today is the science of trauma. But if you haven't done any research or webinars on it, I strongly suggest that you look into that. Because when someone is experiencing trauma, there's actually something that is happening in their brain. There are lots of good YouTube videos by reputable scientists on trauma and the brain. So if you haven't done it, I recommend that you just, Google that or YouTube that and look for those and go through some of those, because it's really informative information about literally different chemicals and things that are released in the brain and what's happening in the brain when a person experiences a trauma, and then how those natural responses in the brain affect then what we then come to deal with as other symptoms that we see, things like the way they tell their story and things like that. So that's the science of trauma, and we're not really going to deal with that today. So if you need to, make sure you go watch some of those or study that out, and to be able to help develop the policies and practices that you are going to establish in your office. So we talk about respond. Again, are we fully integrating what we know about trauma into the work that we provide? And then resist, which is, this is such a strong one. We want to make sure that we are not re-traumatizing the clients that we serve. If you've done this work for any length of time, I'm sure you have met someone who has said that their connection with, or they're going forward and telling their story either to the police or someone in the courthouse has been just as bad as the actual event that took place. And that's something that we don't want. So we have to be thoughtful and intentional about planning how are we not going to re-traumatize people a little bit more. Now we're going to go through this case study, but before we do, I just want to put this up so that you can see. SAMHSA addresses these 6 principles for trauma-informed advocacy. Today, we're going to talk about 3 of them, and it's safety, empowerment, and collaboration. But I just wanted you to get a view of all the 6 that you can probably go into for further detail and study as needed, but I just didn't feel like we were going to have the time to do that today. So what I want you to do now is just read through this case study. I'll give you a minute or so, and then I'm going to ask some questions and ask you to type some things in the chat box, and hopefully we can share some information. So go ahead and read through that. Okay, now we're the 3 main points that we're focusing on today: safety, empowerment, and collaboration. So when we think about safety, and then Kelly, I'm going to need you to just read out anything that someone types in the chat box.
Sure, no problem.
Okay, so question number 1 is, you've read the case study. What ideas or what would you put for how do you make Victoria feel safe?
No
You got
responses
anything?
yet.
Oh my goodness, come on, you guys, wake up, don't be shy.
Here we
What
have
do you
one.
do? Okay,
Assure her of confidentiality.
that's good. That's a good one.
Anybody else have any?
All right, I want to try to address this both pre and post COVID, because I've realized since COVID about myself that I do a lot of my expressing of empathy through facial expressions. Like normally a smile to someone goes quite a long way. But now when a person cannot see your face or see your smile, so if we're like this, and someone's telling us their intimate detailed stories, what are we then doing to make them feel safe or comfortable if this is what they're seeing? You know, most of these masks, they can barely see your eyes. So we're gonna have to then go out of our way to make sure that we're using language that will convey that. Do you clearly, this is the next question. Oh, let me do this one first. Does your office have an established safety protocol? So does your office have an established safety protocol? And that's so important for the survivors that we serve. Like, would people know what to do if you're serving a survivor of domestic violence and someone follows them to the office?
We have one person that wrote yes.
Yes, that's great. That's great. Ours, we have established safety protocols as well, but it's so important, and just to understand that safety from the client's perspective, as well as safety from the service provider's perspective, are both very important, but often very different issues, but both need to be addressed if you are going to have an effective trauma-informed practice. Okay, do you clearly explain objectives in the process? Does someone know exactly what's going to happen when they contact you? Is that clearly explained? And that's really, we hear that often. We have people call on behalf of someone else because they want to know the process first. What's going to happen if my son or daughter calls and says they want services? So we are very clear about the language that we use in explaining the process and what the intake process is like, how confidential the services are. And then now with the COVID, again, that's something that has to be addressed differently. So even explaining to someone, if you're doing like a Zoom meeting with a client, I have these earphones on so that no one else can hear what you're saying. Or I'm in a room by myself. I'm keeping everything you tell me confidential. So things like that are so important. And then this one is a little bit more challenging, and I think people tend not to think of it, and it's just so important that we do. But how would you, in this scenario here, what could you do to give power back to Victoria?
Suzanne, while we're waiting for people to type their responses to that question, we have one. Are those expectations posted for people to access, or is that just common vocabulary you use when you get a call?
That's common vocabulary that we use. We do not have it like posted in the office.
And the responses to your last question, oops, they're moving on me. Hold on. Explain some of her legal options. Commend her for coming in and speaking or sharing about her experience. Ask her what she would like to do. Empower her with choices. Ask her what she would like to see happen in the situation.
Excellent.
She is powerful. She is actively seeking solutions.
Excellent.
Sorry. Do you want more?
Oh, good. Yeah, you've got more?
Okay.
Go for
yeah.
it.
I would encourage her to let law enforcement know so that criminal charges could be filed against her husband. Make sure she understands that she gets to make her own decisions. Provide her with options and choices. Ask their goals for the case or situation. Explain the available legal remedies. Advocate for her desired result. Explain the difference between criminal and civil options. Let her finish crying without embarrassment.
Awesome. Those are all really good. And I'm going to take the last thing because it says Victoria broke down crying. So one thing I was going to ask is, or make sure everybody understands, that we do not have to make someone stop crying because they start crying. I know sometimes it seems just like the common thing is that you want to say, oh, don't cry, or you don't have to cry. But I think often when we're talking about trauma-informed services, we want to then be comfortable letting the person do what they need to do. I mean, I'm not suggesting that you let people go ballistic in your office or anything like that. But if someone starts crying, that we can maybe give them the space for that. Of course, we want to have tissues available where we can offer tissues, but we can say things like, do you want me just to wait? Do you want me to step out? Would you like to reschedule, or do you want to proceed in a few minutes? Things like that. But we don't have to feel like, well, that's the problem that we now have to solve because they're crying. We have to make sure they stop crying. So I'm glad that someone brought that out. Examples that people gave are spot on. We want to, and when we talk about empowerment, we're talking about letting them know what the options are, and then understanding that this is a relationship and that you have the right. I'm here to help you make the choice that you want. What does healing look like for you? And how can I help to serve you? So all those are spot on. You guys were great with that. Did I answer the question that someone asked about, is that all you wanted to know about whether or not we had them posted? I don't know, are other people posting those like that? Because that may be something that we want to consider for our project. We're always realizing that it's a process. Like things come up that we haven't considered, that we realize, oh wait, that might be a little bit more trauma sensitive if we offer this, something that we hadn't thought about. I know recently I had an older person call, and it kind of just popped in my head. Like, I wonder if she wouldn't feel comfortable working with a male. So before I assigned, I had our paralegal ask her, can you just ask her, does she have a preference of whether or not she works with a male or female attorney? And she was like, oh my gosh, no, she would never want to work with a male and have to repeat this information to a male. So that was a new protocol then that we have put into place to just ask people if they have a preference. So it's not like a one and done. It's an evolving process that you notice something, oh, that didn't go over well, so let me make a change. And we're constantly changing in hopes to be better. As more research comes out and we get greater understanding, then we're implementing those changes into the forms that we use and just into the style, the way that we operate and deal with other people.
Suzanne,
Okay.
I'm going to interrupt just for a moment. For the attorneys on the webinar, your question box should have popped up on your screen. Please hit yes or no. You'll have 1 minute to do so. And Suzanne, the person that had asked that question responded, answered, was just curious how people access the information about what your services are.
Okay. Great. Okay, so we talked about safety and how the protocol should not just adjust the client's safety, but also the safety of the service providers. And again, I can't emphasize enough that this has to be thoughtful and intentional. You cannot wait until something happens and then think that you're going to have a great trauma-informed response. It has to be thoughtful and purposeful. I mentioned that I worked previously serving victims of domestic violence, and once I was, and this was years ago, like early 90s, I was on a call, and it was our policy because it was a statewide program. So we had information on each county and the direct number to the sheriff's department in that county. So I was on a call with someone who lived in a different county, and we had went through all the general things that we normally do. Are you sure this is a safe time and you're able to answer questions and receive information? It was yes, yes, yes. 5 minutes into the call, the person is in a panic, screaming, "Oh, he's here. What do I do?" And it sounded like such commotion. And I mean, thank goodness that we had the protocol, that I was able to immediately, and we had, several lines on another line. I had secretary call the sheriff's department for that county and send them right there. And then I just stayed on the line so the police came, and then she's like, "Okay, the police are here." And I was thankful, able to get off the line knowing that at least, she was still alive. But if we hadn't had that protocol in place, and then someone is in a panic, and I couldn't dial 911 because the 911 wouldn't have been the right county. So, and that would have taken so much longer to get her the service that she needed at the time. So it is very important that you think ahead in advance. What are the possibilities? And even like with mass shootings, like what do we do if something unfortunate happens? And then like going forward, even now, I don't know how many people have returned to work, but I know when we return to work, we are going to have to wear masks. If a client comes in, we have masks on site that we can give them if they don't have their own mask, but we are not supposed to provide a service or speak with the clients if they're not wearing the mask. So even explaining that and what that's gonna look like and how different that's gonna feel. So like we have to plan ahead to make sure that the language is such that it will still help us to build that empathy and create that environment where, hey, this is a relationship and we're seeking justice and collaborating together, and that you are safe here. We're wearing these masks because we want to help keep you safe and that you are safe here. So it's gonna be different, but it's just something that we're going to have to work at in advance to make sure that we're saying that in a way that conveys what our intent is. And same thing for collaboration. I know many of you probably are already working with your local rape crisis and domestic violence service providers, but we work in conjunction with them, especially when it comes to safety planning, because I just feel like they are more experts at helping people develop safety plans. So anytime we have a caller, we ask them if they're working along with their advocate. We work to try to build collaborative relationships that they need so that the service feels a little bit more comprehensive. There's service providers who do different things besides the legal services that we provide. And I think one of the best quotes I like from SAMHSA is that idea that you don't have to be a therapist to be therapeutic. That just in the building of the relationship, when we think about understanding and standing in another person's shoes and finding out that who can do the piece that I don't do, and then being able to send them to that person. Then empowerment. I know when we looked at Victoria's story and people said things about explaining the options and then letting that person decide. That's a great way. Pointing out that, hey, you came forward. That's a big deal. You got a protection order once before. You did what you could to protect your children. Just pointing out what the person has already done is empowering. So yeah, it's very important time to do things like that on purpose, because it can be easy just to kind of like, I checked my boxes, I did the legal thing I needed to do and put that stuff aside. But it's just not trauma informed, and the person, it's not going to help that person feel like I'm getting to my wholeness. And we want to help people feel like they're getting to their wholeness, that they're getting back to what health looks like to them. So, but if you don't plan ahead, it's going to be easy not to do it. So it's really about thinking this through And then saying, okay, what am I personally doing to make sure I do that? How can I give empowerment to someone else? I know recently I have a client who, of course, now we're doing everything over the phone. And I know time and scheduling is important. So I had blocked out, okay, I got 30 minutes for this phone call. So during the phone call, I mean, the two of us are honestly at a disagreement. I think she should do something. She doesn't think that she should do it. So she's, ranting and explaining. So I just decided to listen. So the 30 minutes, she goes on and on about how unfair she thinks this is and everything she wanted to say. So I let her go the 30 minutes. And then at the end of the 30 minutes, because that was the time that I had available for that day, and I said, I've heard you. I think it's important that you do what you feel is best for your family. I'm going to hang up now. I'll call you again next week, and you can let me know how you want to move forward. And it seems simple, but I think that helped her to feel empowered. It helped her to feel like she was heard, as opposed to me just saying, hey, listen, yeah, but if you don't do what the judge says, you're going to be in trouble. I mean, I told her that, but not like that. And then gave her the opportunity to vent and to say what she wanted to say, and then just rescheduled for another day. So I know time can be a factor in dealing with people who have suffered trauma, and sometimes multiple traumas. But if scheduling is something that we're going to have to get creative at, and what that looks like and how we can make that work. So empathy. When we talk about empathy, we're talking about using empathy as a pathway to build a relationship. So when doing that, the language that we use is so important. We don't want to, and then think about who does your initial client contact. Who is that person that is responsible for that, or persons? And do they have the same training as the attorneys? Because sometimes that could be an office admin or a paralegal. So we need to make sure that top down, everyone's getting the same training and understanding of the principles of trauma that we're incorporating into our practice. Because we don't want someone to be turned off at the front before they even make that connection with the attorney. So language, we know that's our skill, that's our tool. So words have power. So when we're asking questions, and this is probably some of the more familiar things that we hear about trauma, we want to avoid victim blaming. We don't want to say things like, what'd you do that for? Why didn't you run? We want to have open-ended questions where we allow them to tell their story. One of the symptoms we understand about trauma is that the inability to sometimes tell a story in a linear fashion. So that, again, requires that we provide more time. Like, I'm happy to hear what you have to say today, but we can reschedule and have some additional meetings, and realizing that it may take 3 or 4 meetings before I get this whole story, and then make that more attorney responsibility to put this together in a linear fashion, or a fashion that I need for whatever proceeding the client decides that they want to go forward with. So the language that we use is very important. We can say things like, when did you feel afraid? Or tell me what happened. I know this is hard. What can I do to make you feel more comfortable? All of those are strong things that we can say that will help to be more trauma informed. Now, a grounding technique, I know that's, if you're anything like me, when I first heard that, I thought, oh, it sounds kind of like, I don't know, new age, misty, all out there kind of thing. But now I've really begun to understand and appreciate them. And I think it's so important to just be able to offer it, even if it's something simple. And yes, did I have to do some extra research, some extra webinars to understand, to be able to convey that in a way where, and practice, so that I don't feel so silly telling somebody, okay, why don't you try sitting up straight, make sure your feet are on the floor, let's just take a few deep breaths. I mean, I can do it now and I can feel comfortable doing it, but it goes a long way. It makes a big difference. And honestly, it makes a big difference, not just for the client, it makes a big difference for me as a service provider to be able to know, hey, what can I do real quick to just kind of settle this? Because this is difficult and challenging work that we do. And if we want to do it in a trauma-informed manner that is really competent and successful, we're going to have to build in approaches from different providers that maybe we don't see as traditionally legal services. But when we add those components to the legal services that we provide, it goes a long way in relationship building. So any questions about? Okay. So relationship building. We talk about that. We're talking about, again, empathy. How can I put myself in the client's shoes? And that's, again, to make sure that I'm not like passing judgment. This is not, there's not going to be a cookie cutter approach that every person who comes in, and I know people serve other clients besides domestic violence and sexual assault, but because we do primarily sexual assault, that is kind of where my train of thought tends to stay. But for any client to just think that we're going to have a cookie cutter approach, that everybody who comes in saying that they want a protection order, okay, that's going to go like this, I'm going to do this, 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 and this, and I'm done. That isn't going to work, especially trying to be trauma informed, because trauma is subjective. And two people could experience the exact same incident and respond to it totally different. The effects could be totally different. So while it may seem easier if I have my standard form, and this is what I do, and this is the way that I do it, it's just not trauma informed or trauma sensitive. So we have to learn to, take a minute, put yourself in that person's shoes. Think about sitting with all the traumas that they hold and what that would feel like. And then how can you use that frame of mind to then help you to connect with them in a way that's more relational. And then practice being a good listener. I'm a big component of practice. When we first started our legal project, we actually did practice, okay? Like if a person calls in, we practice going through the intake, saying the words, saying the things that need to be said. What does it sound like? Or maybe I should say that differently. Practice. It's well worth it. And anytime that we can do it up front of someone actually being there, it's even better, because we don't want the clients to be what we're practicing on. We want to just be so intentional that I thought that through. So now I'm ready to deal with that. So it's definitely a skill that can grow, and we can practice being good listeners. Not just that, practice sitting and waiting and not just being, okay, I got to get my response ready, but just listening and then responding. And then being aware of the personal battles that the client is fighting. Often, the clients that we serve, they've actually been through more than one trauma. It is very common that people are sitting with multiple traumas. When you think about, even in the case scenario, Victoria, she's sitting with multiple traumas. The fact that she was herself abused. And then she found out that her children were abused. And it's highly likely that knowledge is probably more traumatizing for her than her own physical abuse. And then many of the clients that we serve, it's almost like they have this generational history of trauma. So, and then now today with the trauma of the Black Americans are feeling around the Black Lives Matter and all that's happening currently in our society, that's a whole nother trauma that if you serve clients of other races, that you're gonna then have to be sensitive to and develop an understanding and a language around how you are going to then respond to that. And then, of course, I think we mentioned this before, don't judge. Don't judge. I mean, I kind of feel like people are getting better about that, but the number of people who have said, why don't you just leave? Why didn't you just leave? That was just like common vernacular that people would say so often about victims of domestic violence. So, we just got to cross that off the list. Don't judge. If you, to this day, still don't understand why people don't just up and walk out the door the minute someone experiences domestic violence, just look at the research. Do some research and some study and to find out what that feels like. There are a lot of survivor stories that are out there and survivor information that will keep us from just making improper judgments. We don't want to judge. And then be intentional about finding a way to relate, to be able to say, hey, I hear you. This is not your fault. This is never your fault. Finding a way to relate. Those are such, and like these are not tools that will cost us any money. These are just things that we have to decide that we value as a person and that I'm going to make a personal investment in doing that. So this is not about grant funding. This is something that we can do because we decide that, hey, we value that. And we want to be that type of law office that values that. Now, there are additional things that you can do that cost money. Like I know we received some grant funding to make our space look more trauma sensitive. And we partnered with our local rape crisis center to come in and do an evaluation of our space and make suggestions to us of what we should do. And we were able to create a really nice space. I don't know if you've never been inside a domestic violence center or a rape crisis center, I would suggest just going in and asking if someone could give you a tour so you can see what it looks like. I was actually surprised. I mean, I've been to several, but you walk in and it just feels like, wow, this is nice. Yeah, I could sit down and talk here. So when we started the legal project, we wanted to create that same feeling, and the advocates were able to help us to create that look. So we have that look in our legal office. But like I said, that's something that costs money. So I just said that if you have it, it is something that can be done. But if you don't, there's a lot that we can do if we just decide this is important enough to do. That I want to be trauma informed. I want to be provide a trauma-informed services. There are lots that we can do as individuals to see that happen. Okay, any other questions or anything before we go on? Talk a little bit about expert testimony.
One comment, well said, job itself is self-fulfilling, being able to help.
Great, thank you. So expert testimony, I know some have called about PCAR, keeps a list of sexual assault advocates who also have been through some training to provide expert testimony. And we see this in criminal cases. But what I'm advocating for here is that people start trying to use them in civil cases just under the regular rules of evidence as experts, and seeing if we can't get some more understanding in front of the court about trauma and the way it affects survivors. And I know that's a big push, and you know, but I just want to put that out there that it's a possibility. If you wanted to use someone on our list, we can make that available. What we do is we try to, if you're in a certain county, then we'll provide an expert who's actually in a different county so that there can be no confusion about that person's going to testify about anyone in the county or anything like that. And they're just giving their expertise is in the responses to trauma and the effects of trauma and how trauma affects a person. So we're looking for ways to hopefully get that in front of the court more so that we can create more understanding about trauma and away from victim blaming. So even if in your opening and closing statements that you have an opportunity to address trauma and trauma responses and how common what this, you know, sometimes it looks like this super odd thing, but maybe you may have the opportunity to address that in an opening or closing argument, asking that you go forward and do that. And if there's any way that a PCAR could assist with that, you know, we're ready to do that. So that's my push for the use of expert testimony. Let's see, any other questions or comments? Okay, let's see, I think we're going to be done early. So let me see if anybody wants to type anything into the chat, like what you would do differently tomorrow based on what you learned today. Is there anything that anybody can say? Oh, yeah. Anybody got anything? That's my contact information. And then I have, you let me know, Kelly, if something comes up. But
Sure.
while we're doing that, I wanna go to these references, because this is more about vicarious trauma and how the trauma that we engage or deal with on a daily basis because of the clients we serve can then affect us. So, and this is like a big push I have, is that lawyers, I don't think, do enough when it comes to self-care. Like, we will say that it's important, but we don't actually want to like take the steps to actually engage in self-care in a way that is meaningful. So I've added this to the reference list as well-being toolkit for lawyers, put out by the American Bar Association. It's really good, and I can honestly say that I'm using it and doing it myself. It's like a booklet that's kind of just background information. And then behind the booklet of background information, there's worksheets. And I think there's about 14 worksheets. So I'm on like I'm doing them 1 week at a time, each worksheet. I think I finished week 2. So I just started doing it. But like the first one is about like happiness. And how do you get happiness in your life? One is about developing a wellness plan. How do you make sure of your own wellness? And because I didn't really realize that even overall, there's studies that say that lawyering is one of the most stressful, occupations around. So I think and then with the clients that we serve, I think it's super important that people be serious about doing something for their own self-care. So I recommend that. And then the second one is just like a law review article about trauma-informed lawyering and how they're starting to teach that in law school, which again, I think is an excellent thing, so that we can hopefully get away from this kind of like, I'm not a therapist assumption, and that I don't need to know these things, and people will start to realize that these are people skills, and developing and growing these people skills, being a better person, is going to make me be a better lawyer. So that's all I have for today. If there are any other questions or comments, I'm happy to entertain them.
Okay. I'm going to launch the second of the CLE poll box questions for attorneys. Please respond. If you're requesting CLE credit for your participation, I will leave that up for a minute. And Suzanne, I will let you know what comments have come in.
Okay.
Experts are a great idea. Issue is the short timeline of PFAs. Where can we find your list of experts, and is it organized by county?
Okay, the list is organized by county, and then you would actually have to call, because they don't put the list out like in a public format. But if you call and say that that's what you want and what county you're in, then we will help to find one that is, in a county close by. Like I said, we don't usually give someone in the same county, but we pick a neighboring county, and then we do that. So you do have to actually call us.
Okay. Keep the empathy flowing, that's all. Make sure I'm being empathetic as opposed to filtering out problems the court can't handle. Spend the time needed with clients to allow them to be heard and set reasonable boundaries. Follow up with clients, lend an ear, and just ask how they're doing, especially during these trying times. Provide resources if they need anything, food from food banks or just general information. Continue to show empathy. Another good book is Trauma Stewardship by Laura Van Der Noot Lipsky with Connie Burke. Hear the client out completely till the end. Good strategy to make them feel empowered and that we care. Thanks so much. This was very helpful. Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. Thank you.
You know what? Let me say this before we go. With all the COVID and the different formats, and then it brings a whole nother list of things that you have to ask about in order to be trauma sensitive. So one, we don't want to assume that everybody has access to the internet. So it is a question that you have to ask, like, are you able to get on the internet if they like have a scheduled hearing and it's by Zoom? So we want to ask that, and then we want to make sure that they know how to work that. I did hear this on a different webinar where someone just felt like their client, when she turned on the camera screens, that the perpetrator was there and was just like glaring at her, and they were kind of like sitting in a holding room waiting for the judge to come up, but it was all on Zoom. So they were able to call her on the phone and tell her, you know, turn your camera off until the judge comes. So just little things like that, that we now have to rethink. If this is going to be an online process, what are the other things that we need to make sure clients have available, or that clients need to know in order to feel safe and empowered?
Okay, the rest of the comments are thank you for the presentation. And the final one said, it is so important to remember to ask the client what she would like to see happen.
For sure. Yeah. Yep. There's no cookie cutter approach. So that's all about empowering and collaborating, is asking them. The way we phrase it is, what does help look like to you? And we actually have that on our intake form. What does help look like to you?
Okay, Suzanne. Well, if you don't have anything else, I don't see any other comments or questions coming in. So thank you so much for being here with us today. We really
You're welcome.
appreciate it. I think we got a lot out of this and gave us a lot to think about. So thank
I
you so
hope
much
so.
for your time.
All righty.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.